Why this topic and why Yale SOM? As you all well know, we could actually, if we could do a recitation and hear everybody, we could have a chorus of the mission of SOM is educating leaders for business and society. And from its founding, and I'm happy to say still, the tradition is quite strong, both in the curriculum and in the broader activities of the school. What we look at is the interplay among the public, private, and nonprofit sectors. And the program on social enterprise in particular is focused on looking at the role of business as a proactive player in addressing social issues. So we have a wealth of resources to choose from, and I'm very pleased that our panelists have been able to join us. Income and wealth equality are in the top of the news now, whether you're listening to NPR or watching Fox News. It's as much a domestic as an international issue. And basically what we see is that the economic advances and the economic setbacks of the last several decades have been accompanied by the creation of an enormous gap in income and in wealth. And that's what we're going to try to address, particularly on the domestic front today. I mean, the term, the 1%, in the last several years has entered common parlance. And what we want to try to do is unbundle some of what's led to that, but more importantly, how can the different sectors address it in terms of U.S. economic development? So regardless of the Yale connection, we probably couldn't find three people better able to speak to this issue. Samira Fazeli is a 2006 graduate of the Yale Law School, and until a few weeks ago was at the White House as senior policy advisor on the National Economic Council. Colleen Briggs is a 2013 SOM graduate and a former student of mine. She's now Vice President of Financial Capability and Consumer Initiatives at JP Morgan Chase in New York. And Andrea Levere, who was one of my mentors when I was at SOM, is a class of 1983 and is president of the Corporation for Enterprise Development, of which you'll be hearing about more shortly. So the order in which we're going to go is I'm going to ask first Samira from the public sector angle, and then Colleen from the private sector, and then Andrea from the nonprofit, or what my students now refer to as the social sector. Two questions. So the first question is to ask you to comment on three interrelated issues that really are at the core of our topic: inequality, insecurity, and immobility. And what do you see as the role of your respective sector in tackling those issues? So to start with Samira, what do you see as underlying those, and what are the major federal policy responses to these kinds of issues? So we'll turn to Samira.
Okay. I think there are a number of levers that the federal government has to address those three interrelated issues. The first is the public sector and the federal government has a unique megaphone, and we often refer to it as the bully pulpit, which we can use to shine a spotlight on an issue. For the federal government in particular, that spotlight is national in scope and can be used to foster and support national conversations on important topics. And you saw this administration use that megaphone to focus the country's attention on the issue of inequality and immobility. Back in December 2013, the president himself called it a defining challenge of our time, that the basic bargain of America, which has always been if you work hard, you can get ahead, is now at risk given the growing inequality and the lack of upward mobility that we have experienced over the past few decades. And while we in the public sector don't create that conversation on our own or have it on our own or in isolation of the other sectors, our public leaders have a unique power to lead and manage these sorts of public and national conversations, keep it in the public mindset so that the American people are focused on it, are thinking about it, are trying to understand what drives it and proposing solutions to it so that we can all work together to create those solutions. I would say the second lever that the public sector has, or the role that we have, is that we lay the basic foundations to enable our society to counter immobility and inequality. And nothing is more important than making sure we've created the right enabling environment for businesses to grow, innovate, and create quality jobs. If you look at the steps we took as an administration when we first came in to pull us out of the worst economic crisis since the Great Depression, we have now grown faster than anyone could have imagined from that deficit. And we're in the midst of the longest streak of private sector job growth on record. 60 straight months, 5 straight years, 12 million new jobs. And we're finally starting to see signs of middle-class wages starting to tick up. So government, the federal government in particular, has to be laser focused on making sure we're creating those conditions for businesses to grow and to create quality jobs. And then the last thing is, obviously, we work with the other sectors to design and try to establish policies that are going to address these challenges. And it's not just about designing new policies or reforming existing programs. It's also about making sure that the programs we have in place today to counter immobility and inequality are actually delivering on those promises. And no policies are more important to countering inequality than having a strong set of social insurance programs in place. We call them social insurance because ideally what you want is an insurance policy that we all pay into and hope we never have to use. And if we do use it, we want to make sure that it's temporary. It helps us get back on our feet. And that's what the evidence tells us today is overwhelmingly happening in our system. It's a trampoline. People use it for some time to get back on their feet. One study showed that typically people are using the social safety net for 1 to 2 years, and then they move above the poverty line. They may move below it again in their lifetime and use the system again, but they're not trapped in it for decades. Many historic programs that grew out of the war on poverty were reformed over the years to reward and encourage work, make sure they help people get back on their feet. And these programs have become the rungs on the ladder that help people reach their economic goals. While they need to undergo continuous improvement to strengthen them, that should always be our goal, to strengthen and reform, not cut them willy-nilly. So those are, I think, some 3 levers that the public sector and the federal government in particular has to counter these 3 interrelated important issues of our time.
Thank you. Very well said. Colleen, from the perspective of the private sector, and particularly of a major bank, how can engagement in the capital markets be a lever to either increase or address inequality? And certainly from the vantage point of JP Morgan, the capital markets is a key issue, but also I think you also wanted to talk about the role of business more broadly, so please feel free.
Yeah, and I just want to apologize again for the technical difficulties, but I appreciate the question. I think our CEO has actually said, Jamie Dimon has said that income inequality and the lack of access to economic opportunity is not only a moral issue, but it's a significant concern for our company and our country. And he's really called on other private sector players to do more to improve it. And I think when you look at the scale and the scope of this challenge, like inequality and immobility, it's clear that government and philanthropic capital alone is not going to be enough. I think capital markets can and they must be part of the solution as far as identifying and funding new innovative business models that can help contribute to new solutions to this. And the way that I view the work that we do as a bank is I think there's 3 key ways that we can do this. The first, and this is something our CEO has said pretty publicly many times in response to this question, is that as a bank, one of the most powerful ways that we can create opportunities is providing capital to businesses, governments, and nonprofits they need in order to grow and create jobs. But then secondly, and I think this is something that we've really built out and been sort of leaders in the field, is helping not only help our clients identify and reduce the risks of their investments, but then also creating the tools to help them capitalize on new opportunities to help transition to a more sustainable global economy. And so, essentially, these are just creating opportunities to drive funds toward investments that might promote economic opportunity and away from activities that might undermine those. And so, through those efforts, we, first look at sort of how we can help our clients. We've got teams of experts here that help evaluate the risks associated with certain corporate lending, debt and equity underwriting, and advisory transactions. And there's an opportunity there to not only help raise, the risks that might be inherent or how they might be contributing to some of these challenges, but then also thinking proactively about how we can help, drive these funds to actually, improve economic opportunity broadly. And we've also deployed millions of not only our own capital, but also our clients' capital to help improving the lives and the economic opportunity of low income and underserved populations around the world. So I think there's a proactive role for finance to play as well, thinking about how we can use the full suite of advisory, underwriting, and lending capabilities for our clients to help drive funding into these types of investments. And I think right now, we've never seen so many investment products available across asset classes and thematic focus areas that can really help us target these funds to address some of these underlying root causes of inequality and immobility. And then the third category, and I think we're, something that obviously I work in and I'm working very closely on, is you're seeing companies are increasingly driving their philanthropic investments and their expertise into addressing challenges like inequality and immobility that impact the communities where they operate. And so, through our philanthropic initiatives, as well as what you're seeing from other corporations as well, is they're seeing the interconnectedness between the role of philanthropy and how that can actually improve the competitive operating environment for their broader core business. And so, here at the foundation, we focus our initiatives all around this theme of how do we promote economic opportunity for individuals to help them overcome inequality. And so we do that through community development, small business development, financial capability, which is what I work on with partners like CFED to help ensure that low to moderate income consumers have the tools they need to increase their savings, improve their credit, and build their assets. And then finally, the one that I just wanted to highlight, because I do think you're seeing a lot more activity from the private sector, is support for demand-driven skills training. So, banks can not only support job creation, which is important, but how do we also make sure that people have the skills and the training they need to compete for these jobs? We hear from our clients all the time that they can't find workers with the necessary skills. And in the US, we have roughly 4 million jobs that are unfulfilled due to the skills gap, which just further contributes to that income and opportunity gap. And so in last year, we launched a $250 million initiative called the New Skills at Work Initiative, which helps not only identify the skills that employers need, but then how do we make sure that we get that information to people looking for jobs, and then fund programs that help these potential workers get the skills they need to fill those openings. And so, I realize this is sort of one initiative, but I think there's more that we can be doing to get more private sector players focused on this issue to help reduce the skills gap, shrink the income gap, and ultimately, strengthen economies broadly. But as more companies step up on challenges like this, I think the markets will also catch up and continue to flow investments to opportunities like this.
Thank you. Thank you. So we're going to turn next to Andrea Levere, who has a few very snappy slides that I think capture a lot of this, also to underpin her talk, but also her remarks, but also I think it illustrates the whole set of issues we're grappling with. So, Andrea?
Tony, thank you, and thank you for this opportunity to share the screen with such fabulous partners. You've asked me to begin by describing the asset building field. And I start with a phrase, which is not just what you earn, but it's also what you own. And that really guides our philosophy that the answer to inequality and insecurity is a focus as well on social insurance, as Samira shared, but also on savings and assets. So let me begin just talking a little bit about the basic numbers on wealth inequality. This comes from the Federal Reserve Survey of Consumer Finance. And it shows you how over a 24-year period, which is barely a blink of the eye, how wealth has become increasingly concentrated, with the top 3% of earners going from 45% to 54% of total wealth, and the bottom 90% going roughly from a third to a quarter. This is also heightened by the issue around race. I don't have that slide, but 90% of all wealth in the United States is held by white households, with Black and Hispanic households each holding less than 3% of the nation's wealth. But wealth inequality isn't the only thing. An issue we focus on very specifically is the issue of financial insecurity. And this slide is going to show you the outcome from a measure that we created called liquid asset poverty, which is a measure that says, could you exist at the poverty level for 3 months with your savings if your main source of income was disrupted? 44% of American households are in liquid asset poverty. 61% of households of color, and 4 in 5 of our poorest households. While this data point is incredibly distressing, what it has done for us is change the conversation. So it's not just about those poor people, but it's about half of us. And when we release this data, I become the star guest on the drive-by radio shows because the DJs say, ah, that's me too. And so it's one of those issues that makes this and the strategies we want to deploy much more universal. To this issue of insecurity, we want to add the issue of mobility. If there's anything, and Samira raised this, that characterizes the United States, it's the American dream. That if you work hard, in fact, you can succeed and you can improve your economic status. But what data from the Pew Charitable Trust tell us is that, in fact, 62% of Americans born at the top stay there, and 65% of Americans born at the bottom stay there. Another data point that's very distressing is that a study by the Russell Sage Foundation found that of all the major developed nations in the world, the US was the 3rd from last in terms of economic mobility. The final data point shares the results from a study we did of how the tax code actually increases inequality rather than addressing it. In 2013, the government spent $540 billion to help Americans build wealth. Through retirement savings, small business, home ownership, and other forms of tax incentives. When we counted it all up, the top 1% get more from these incentives than the entire bottom 80% combined. And we think about our mission of making everyone a productive member of the economy. There's certainly a way we can do this better. So if I'm to say, what's the focus of where we want to go? Next slide. It's really to add savings and assets to the opportunity equation. This really starts from our values that we believe that all people have the capability to be economically productive, which is, I think, why we're all here on this webinar, and that we have a spirit of innovation in the nation that we can capture to help us do this. And at the same time, we are acutely conscious that there's no silver bullet, and that what's really necessary is a range of strategies that work together. So I'll finish just highlighting what we think are the 5 most productive strategies that can move us forward. One, and I share this work with Colleen, is really integrating financial inclusion. That's getting people access to mainstream financial products rather than have them use alternative financial services like check cashers and payday lenders, and integrating financial capability into our major public systems and institutions that serve low and moderate income people. We also are huge advocates in providing children and parents match savings accounts to save for the future. We have incredible data that shows the impact both on household financial security and on aspirations and a view towards the future. We are very invested in focusing on product innovation. The impact of technology in really changing the cost structure of how you serve low and moderate income people has made things possible today that even a few years ago we could not do. And it makes the future in this area quite bright. We also have to build the evidence base of what works. And one of the things we've learned is that a lot of our assumptions have been wrong in how to set up these programs. And so we use the best techniques of market analysis in really working with our clients and customers to figure out what they want, as well as deploy behavioral sciences to help us figure out how do you make something like savings fun, because that's the only way that people are going to do it. And finally, and this is back to Samira's first point, we advocate and develop policies at the municipal, state, and federal level that can address this, whether expanding the Earned Income Tax Credit, the most effective anti-poverty program in America, or figuring out how to scale children's savings programs to every child born in America. So that's our view, and I look forward to the discussion.
Thank you, Andrea. So again, for our participants, I encourage you, if you are inclined, to use the questions box down below to put in questions, and you can either do general questions, or if there's a specific panelist you'd like to respond to a specific question you have, please put those in. So you have a few minutes to do that. I'm going to turn now to my second question for each of our colleagues and ask them, how does your respective sector engage with the other two sectors, and what's the appropriate role of each? Samira started to talk about that a bit in terms of partnerships, and I think each of the three have noted it, but what do you see as, we'll start with Samira, the role of the public sector in this? I think you started to go at that in terms of creating the policy environment and the social insurance or social protection underpinning that then allows people to take advantage of economic opportunities. Do you want to expand on that, Samira, in terms of the role of the public sector and how to engage most productively with the private and nonprofit sectors?
Yeah, I want to kind of open up the big black box of government for the alumni audience so they get a better perspective on how it is we do what we do at the federal level. But first, before I dive into that, I do want to make a plug for what I think is the appropriate role of each sector is simply to engage, period. Figure out what you think you should or could do and then go out and do it. And I think this audience of SOM grads is the training you receive at SOM is all about how you can do such things. And I see this audience as one of those audiences that was raised to do this kind of work. Speaking as a first-generation American, I've always been struck by America's culture of civic engagement and how that intersects with its entrepreneurial spirit. Americans often look difficult social problems straight in the eye and they roll up their sleeves and say, okay, what can I do about this? Which isn't true of every country. In some places, people complain endlessly about what government isn't doing for them rather than thinking through President Kennedy's challenge, which I still think rings true today, of asking first what I can do for my country. So the first thing I'll say is just do something. But the reason I say that is engagement is so important because the public sector and the federal government always works with the other two sectors as it searches for solutions to tackling inequality and immobility. We know that government cannot solve any of these problems on its own, and that engagement is critical to crafting good policy. I didn't have an appreciation for that until I entered federal service and found out just how much of my work was to simply call Andrea. Policymakers are always hungry to hear from experts and stakeholders in the nonprofit sector, in the private sector, in academia, or from non-experts, from just the man on the street. For one, we seek them out because, as Colleen noted, the private sector, and I include the nonprofit sector in that, are where the innovation happens. It is really difficult for the public sector to innovate and take on completely unknown risks. Frankly, there is just too much political risk for failure. And one bad news story can not only find you hauled before congressional committees testifying endlessly, but can also set the movement back at trying to achieve that goal or counter that problem because people are just focused on the scandal. So what we do at the federal level is often fund research. We grant waivers to allow others to test their ideas, but we will rarely design something wholly on its own. And instead, we build off models that have been tried and tested elsewhere. If you look at the ACA, kind of the crowning achievement of this administration, it was built off what they did in the state of Massachusetts and what they tested there. The second thing we do is we turn to the nonprofit sector and the private sector for their expertise. Like I said, I literally would call Andrea to find out what the latest evidence is on the effectiveness of child savings accounts at lifting high school completion rates for low-income children, so I could figure out ways to better integrate savings and assets buildings into existing government programs and help make the argument on the inside for why that achieves greater goals that all of us can get behind and think are important. When I worked at housing finance reform at the Treasury Department, I would have investment banking experts sit with us to give us their perspective on what Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac could be replaced with, what they have learned in all their testing and innovating of different products and structures in the mortgage-backed security space. We know that some experts are going to have their bias, but nonetheless, we value their perspective and know they're going to be key partners in tackling the problems. We also know in some instances they may be the obstacles, but we still want to talk to them and understand their perspectives. And finally, like I said, we just want to hear from everyone to learn about their experiences, because you can't design or administer policies for all if you're not talking to everyone and hearing what works for them, what doesn't work for them, and if we're even asking the right questions, like are we focused on solving the wrong problem? I'm sure many of you have heard the term inside the Beltway mentality, but Washington is a very insular city. And it is helpful to interact with people from outside that city to get a fresh perspective on your work and to bring in new ideas and new solutions and ask the questions in new ways. And then one of the important things I think the federal agencies do, and an important role we play, is to listen, convene, and synthesize. And this convening power should not be underestimated. In this era of partisan gridlock on the Hill, the administration has made bold and powerful moves towards tackling inequality solely through this convening power. We bring all the stakeholders together. We try to see what they can contribute to solving the problem. You saw that yesterday in the announcement the White House made at their science fair. Over $240 million in new private sector commitments were announced to prepare students for excellence in STEM fields, that's science, technology, engineering, math. And a lot of that money was focused on underrepresented groups. Colleen talked about it in demand-driven training. We've done a lot of work as an administration to try to reform federal programs that prepare workers for the workplace to make it more demand-driven, but we've also brought together a lot of the private sector stakeholders to figure out, does the system work for employers today, and can we lift up what they are doing in the private sector to try to tackle this problem and improve that system? So that's kind of some of the federal perspective on how we think about engaging the other two sectors and how our work cannot happen without engagement with the other two sectors.
Thank you, Samira. Thank you. Colleen, from your vantage point in technologically challenged JP Morgan, what do you see as the role of the private sector, and particularly the private financial sector, and how do you partner and in what ways with government and nonprofits?
Yeah, so I think I agree with Samira that I think a lot of, what's exciting is sort of some of the initiatives that I outlined earlier about the role of, innovating and trying new models in the private sector, and specifically in, the banking sector. There's a huge opportunity to deploy more capital into opportunities that invest in those new innovations and bring them to scale. I think it's also really exciting to think about the new sort of long-term value creation that the private sector is looking into more about how do we see the role of stakeholders in our success, and then thinking more holistically about even how we define economic value creation, looking much more at the sort of the long-term picture and thinking beyond just quarterly profits, but more about quality products and how do we invest for the long term. And I would say, I completely agree with Samira. I think from our perspective, any of the innovations that we engage in really are not successful without that broad cross-sector coordination and collaboration. And I think the most important thing really is that engagement piece. All of the most innovative programs that we've worked on or supported have all hinged on that type of engagement. It really requires just bringing in some expertise of different sectors and bringing those to bear when tackling some of these challenges. When I think about the role of government, not only do I agree about the convening role, we also think about all of the different touch points that they have with consumers. And there's so many opportunities to embed strategies that promote economic opportunity through government platforms. And I know Andrea has been really a leader in that, and probably we'll have more to say on that in particular. But then also just creating policies that invest in more inclusive growth strategies. Andrea highlighted some of the tax incentives. I think there's more opportunity for the government to play around, how do we make sure that those are fair and inclusive tax incentives. As Samira mentioned, worker training, they're really sort of leading these efforts and these conversations by convening private sectors players to help, push the field forward on what it means to even invest in demand-driven skills training. You can think of education policy, immigration reform. The list is extremely long about how the government plays a role in investing in those inclusive strategies. And then finally, and something that we engage in a lot is, the powerful levers that they have to accelerate new industries for impact. Thinking about how they promote that fair and robust competition, establishing appropriate regulation and promoting entrepreneurship. Those are all particularly, of interest to me in the work that I do, focused on how do we scale new financial products and services that help consumers increase savings, improve their credit, and build wealth. As we think about the role of fostering the next generation of financial service organizations, both for-profit and nonprofit, government plays a really critical role in the work that we do every day, and thinking about how can we create that, the rules of the road to really help these ecosystems in this new sector thrive. And then on the nonprofit side, I would say we even created an office of nonprofit engagement because we saw it was so critical to get that regular feedback that Samira mentioned. It really is the way that we get the insights from the communities that we're serving. No one understands this, especially as we think about the philanthropic initiatives, no one understands low to moderate income consumers better than nonprofit partners. Even understanding the needs of the community. When we went in and made the $100 million commitment to Detroit, the first thing we did was just a listening tour, where we met with nonprofit partners in the community and with local officials who really understood the needs and helped us design our strategy before we made investments. They also help us spot trends and give us strategic insight into what are some of the risks and the concerns of the communities that we care about, which is why this Office of Nonprofit Engagement has been a great tool for us to help make sure we're feeding that into our products and services. Also, some of the most innovative programs that I've seen have come out of the nonprofit sector. That's where we see that, those really risky sort of early stage innovations occurring. Andrea was mentioning a few of those. And very often that's where we see even the private sector adopting some of those innovations and applying them to their products and services. And so I would say, as we think about how we collaborate, I think not only is there an opportunity to help us design and implement and improve the programs that we support, but then they also, I think, regular collaboration, regular knowledge sharing also can help spur innovation across the entire ecosystem, by regularly sharing those insights and making sure that all providers, have those best practices. And that only occurs when you have that regular engagement. And then, finally, I think as we think about supporting new sectors that are addressing some of these issues, it really requires, most of our strategies are around what we call sort of sector-based investing, which is how do you engage all of these players and make the investments not only in, organizations along the return continuum from nonprofits at one end all the way up to for-profits with a social return at the other, but then also making sure you've got the strong infrastructure and supportive regulatory environment to help some of these innovative new solutions get to scale. And so again, I think all of those only occur with that regular engagement that Samira mentioned.
Thank you, Colleen. Strong themes of collaboration. Andrea, from your perspective, what do you see as the role of the nonprofit or the social sector, and how do you collaborate with the other sectors?
So thanks, Tony. I think none of this happens without a forced sector approach, and that includes the private, public, nonprofit, and philanthropic. And as we've said, if we don't do that, we are basically a boutique approach. We are not at all scaling what our solutions are. Our business model is connecting community practice, what happens on the ground, with public policy and private market in new and effective ways so we can scale our approach. And if anything we've learned with the foreclosure crisis and the recent recession is that we have to all look at this together. So I think about a couple of ways that this is working in ways that both give me hope and frame out the future. And we've talked a little bit about how we bring financial inclusion and financial capability into large public systems, but we also are thinking about how do we integrate that into employers, because employers increasingly are feeling the costs of their employees and their financial insecurity. So how do we help them create systems and training that help their employees build financial security? So we're looking across public systems, private systems. Yesterday, I spent the entire day with the 11 most effective affordable housing developers in America, who all had come to the conclusion, in fact, that if they didn't deal with the financial insecurity of their residents, they were not going to make the impact that they needed to. So, and that becomes a complicated arrangement with policy and also private sector to make those changes. Secondly, Samira raised up the point, one of the innovations I'm most excited about is children's savings. This is an innovation that's being run by cities, by counties, by school districts, but that takes a bank. We have to have a financial institution that's part of that and holding the accounts. And we also have to have nonprofit and public sector who are partnering in that execution. We are in the conversation with a treasurer of a major Midwest city who is working with credit unions to provide these accounts and has identified a fascinating source of revenue, which is because she manages all the parking fees, to think about how does that build out the future of our children in this city. And then there's an area that is absolutely critical that many of us who've been in this field for a long time didn't pay adequate attention to. And that's the area of protection. How do we provide all Americans, but in particular low and moderate income Americans, protection when they seek out financial products and services? So many of us work very closely with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau because the advent of technology has dramatically changed the way we get our financial products and services. And there's a whole set of institutions that are not regulated or are only soon to be regulated. And so the role of the public sector in providing those protections is absolutely critical to protecting the wealth that we build. And then the role of financial institutions in adopting best practices, so in some ways those protections aren't necessary, is critical. I'm on the Committee on Economic Inclusion for the FDIC, and one of the exciting things that we see happening is the largest financial institutions creating accounts that have guardrails on them that will help people from overdrafting and have what we call the $42 cup of coffee. And then create an account that helps them build the savings that we are all intent that they do. So I could go on forever with the examples, but I think the nature of our economy, and this goes back to our SOM education, the intersection and integration is beyond anything that I ever imagined when I was there 3 decades ago. And it's only going to increase.
Thank you, Andrea. Thanks to each of you. So we have a lot of questions. We won't be able to cover them all, but I'm going to pick a few, particularly that are directed at a specific person. So this question is addressed to Colleen Briggs. Can you expand upon how to identify skills gaps in the workforce and how to bridge those gaps?
Yeah, absolutely. So as part of our initiative, it really is starting with the data. A lot of what we've seen is that there's just a lack of data around what is the skills gap, and really understanding what are the high growth industries where we're seeing more opportunities for people to participate. So the first is really around how do we compile and disseminate labor market data that helps inform stakeholders make decisions about funding and programmatic work. And then the next part of this is, also very closely tied to that data is how do we engage employers, especially in sector clusters, around how they think about what are the skill sets that they need for the available jobs and what are career pathways that are available, and that sort of helps further tell a richer story than just the data alone. And then, once we've got the data, we've got that picture, then how do we invest in skills-based training in those high-growth sectors that have been identified out of that data using industry-vetted curriculum? And again, that's another important part where we need to engage a lot of different employers as we think about what the curriculum is so that people are actually getting the right skill sets. And we work really closely with not only other private sector employers, but also education and training providers. Community colleges are playing a really critical role in that. And then, finally, a lot of what we do is creating more robust workforce partnerships that just regularly bring together these employers and these training providers so that we're developing internships, apprenticeships, other sort of learn and earn models so people can actually apply these lessons at the workplace. And a big thing that's very different than our strategy than what we've done in the past and what some other folks have been doing is saying that we realize that some of these skills gaps require looking beyond just the traditional 4-year college and also thinking about the role of certifications and other training services when helping to address it.
Thanks, Colleen.
Tony, can I jump in there and just say
Please.
one quick thing, just to build on what Colleen just said. For companies to try to reevaluate their position descriptions and what those qualifications are is like a hugely important piece of that puzzle. In the past, they would just blankly write 4-year degree required, but I think a lot of companies are now stopping and thinking, is a 4-year degree necessary, or was that a proxy for something else in the past? Could a certification and a credentialing that we all work together to agree through these curriculums that Colleen mentions, are those going to be a better proxy for the true skills we need to get that job done? And one sector where a lot of people see a lot of potential is the IT sector, because a lot of the jobs in that sector pay higher wages, higher than median income, and don't necessarily require the 4-year degree to have the requisite skills to work in those jobs. And there's a huge there's a huge gap right now, a lot of jobs available in that sector and not enough people who have the skills needed to fill those jobs.
Thanks. Let me direct it at Andrea, but I think we can also be open to others responding. So could you talk some about the specific ways the federal tax code perpetuates inequality or could be a tool to reduce inequality?
I'll start with the positive, and then I can always go backwards, which is one of the areas that we believe has an outside impact is helping people to save. And we currently do not have a universal platform that helps people to save or a set of incentives that can make a big difference. So when we think about what kind of incentives could we have, there's a policy called the Savers Credit. It's a really great idea. The Savers Credit only works if you have high enough income to deduct. It's just a deductible item. So many people who are in a lower tax code can't get the benefit of saving, without it. So we have simply said, let's make the saver's credit refundable for everybody so they can get the benefit of saving. And I want to make a point, because many people reasonably say, why would you ask low-income people to save? They don't have enough income to begin with, but you shouldn't make an unfair requirement. My first data point is that we did a national demonstration with match savings accounts for adults to match their savings to buy a home, invest in education, or start a business. And our stunning outcome, which we never expected, was that the people in the lowest incomes saved the highest proportion. And when they were asked by the researchers why they did that, they said that was the price of hope. The second part of that is that parents will do for their children what they won't do for themselves. And as they think about the future and they build that over time, they will also save in ways they wouldn't. So that's a very simple change in the tax code we've been trying to do for many, many years, which hasn't happened. The flip side, which many, I think my other panelists can speak to, is how we incent homeownership, right? We have a policy that both allow you to deduct your mortgage interest. Many of us know that Warren Buffett often stands up and says, I live in public housing because the federal government subsidizes my home ownership. We also subsidize up to 2 homes, and there is a very high limit on how much you can deduct. The most rigorous research has said what this is encouraging people to do is buy bigger houses, which we know for a whole host of reasons is not good for climate change, for other things. Many mainstream economists have suggested that we don't, people think that the home mortgage deduction is in the Constitution, so we're not going to change that. It actually isn't, just in case you're confused. But we limit rather than eliminate it. We say you can only take it to this part. And then we think creatively about how we help other people do home ownership right, which means how do they build the savings for the down payment that increases their success rate as a homeowner. So those are just 2 examples. And I'd love Samira or Colleen to jump in.
On the tax code, Samira?
Sure. On the tax code, I would say it's one of the most powerful levers we have is redistribution through the tax code. I mean, there's just no other way to say it. But in this current environment, it's going to be very difficult to achieve a lot of what we all know are really important policies, like the saver's credit. Like if you look at our retirement system, it's very upside down right now. It helps the highest income people save, but not the lower income people save. And beyond what we can do through legislation and through policy, tax time is a really critical moment for most low and moderate income families. And thinking creatively about what you can do at tax time, because that is when families look at their balance sheet, make consumption and savings allocations decisions. It's a very important moment that behavioral economics has revealed to us. And so doing more through local VITA coalitions or through private tax preparers, because that is the moment where that refund, what families do with that refund, which is a forced savings mechanism for many of them who are trying to decide, do I use that to pay off debt or to establish savings, or can I split it? Can I do multiple things with it? There's a lot of important innovation happening in the private sector and the nonprofit sector around that moment, which has a lot of promise for how do you start building financial security for low and moderate income people and help them do that asset building work that is so critical and important, given that most Americans don't even have $500 in emergency savings. It's shocking when you look at the data that's come out of the latest survey of consumer finance.
Colleen, anything you'd like to say on the tax code?
Well, I'll say, I used to handle tax policy for Senator Stabenow, so I have a lot of opinions that are unrelated to my current job. But I agree. I think Andrea's point of really, evaluating the credits and who's benefiting, I think can really be valuable for a lot of policymakers. But also, tax time, I completely agree, is one of the best, as we think about sort of a great teachable moment where you can get somebody, thinking about talking to them about other opportunities as they're getting one of the largest lump sum payments that many low to moderate income consumers receive all year. And then also just making sure that they're getting the benefits that they've earned. You know, as we think about how many people still don't even get their full, their earned income tax credit, one of the largest anti-poverty tools that's available for low to moderate income consumers that we've seen from a policy perspective. There's much more we can do working with community partners, to Samira's point, to make sure that people are getting what they've earned, and then using that as an opportunity to not only start building that emergency savings that can help them weather unexpected emergencies, but then also thinking about sort of long-term opportunities. And that's a great moment to just engage them on that conversation, because it's salient to them, it's relevant as they're getting that large sum of money.
Thank you. So there's lots of more good questions. I wish we had more time, but we don't. One simple one I can answer though, of can we access Andrea's slides? Yes, we'll send everybody the link for the webinar, and Andrea's slides will be there. And Andrea, I'll give you the option if you want the longer version to be posted as well. We could offer that if you're open to it.
Sure.
So I'd like to give each of our panelists just a couple of minutes to offer concluding remarks, and particularly in the spirit of what do you see as positive trends, particularly within the sector you work in, moving forward from where we are now in addressing these issues. So again, let's start with Samira from the public sector angle. Positive trends moving forward.
I want to give two positive trends. I think one is there's been a real move towards both evaluation and data-driven policy that are both focused on trying to deliver better services for the dollars we spend, so help taxpayers get the most out of their dollars. I also think it's really, this trend is so important because it helps reestablish public confidence in government, because we're able to demonstrate that we're running efficient and effective programs by evaluating the results of what we're doing, and supporting a kind of culture of continuous evaluation, where programs are actually tested at whether they're effective at solving the problems they're meant to solve. I'll bring up the demand-driven training example again. Like, we pay so much in our system towards workforce development, but we're not quite sure it's helping people get jobs at the end of the day, and trying to make sure that we're also being mindful of waste, fraud, and abuse. That is linked to what I see as another trend going forward, which is the growth of this cross-sector collaboration and engagement. A lot of people also talk about the rise of the fourth sector. So searching for socially entrepreneurial solutions. It's not just that all of us panelists have drank the SOM Kool-Aid on this. It really is the way the world works today. All sectors working together, and more people are realizing that. And you're seeing a real shift in generation in what Gen X and Ys and millennials are looking for as they come into the workforce. They want jobs in which they can have a social impact while they're raising their families and earning a good income. You see this in the rise of things like impact investing, or the growth of triple and double bottom line companies. What unites that movement with a data-driven policy is a strong focus on measuring social performance and evaluating social performance, not just financial performance, because for that sector to truly grow, it has to be held accountable for actually delivering on the social commitments or objectives that it's setting out for. And as I sat in government and tried to think about policy solutions we could have to grow that sector, it continuously returned to the question of, are they measuring what they're doing? Are they measuring their outcomes? And I couldn't support and recommend policy solutions until I had evidence of that. What Colleen spoke about, that risk continuum, is really true. You see out there, counterintuitively, the nonprofit sector is the one that takes on the most risk, and then the private sector, and then the public sector. And as each of those do the evaluation, it helps move policies and programs and solutions forward. So.
Thank you. Colleen?
Yeah, so I would say, yeah, similarly, I think, what we're seeing in just this next generation of business leaders, and I think, everyone on the phone, I think, has a lot to contribute to that, really are more socially concerned and committed as employers, consumers, and investors. And I think that what's really exciting is the role that they're going to play in each one of those areas to really drive change forward. So as an employer, thinking about long-term value creation, and the role of stakeholders and creating both economic and social returns. I think you're seeing just more employers thinking about more holistically about how they define the role of stakeholders in value creation. I think that's really encouraging, as well as thinking about how do they contribute more than capital to some of these social problems, seeing the expertise that they can bring to bear on some of these, and aligning their strategic philanthropy aligned with their core competencies, and applying that strategy has shown a huge impact, and I think we'll continue to see more of that in the future. As you think about what Samira was saying around, an investor side, increased transparency and accountability in the capital markets is going to be transformative as we think about the role of financing going forward. And then finally, I would say, something that Andrea touched on is just the role of technology and promoting social good. It's something we do focus a lot of our time and efforts here about how can we leverage all these big trends of big data, cloud-based computing, all of these things. We're seeing it transforming entire industries, not only driving down the cost to serve, more vulnerable populations, but also meeting consumers where they are and bringing solutions that are really designed around them and fit within their lives. And I think one of the things we're going to see more of going forward is just more disruptors using this, harnessing these trends for social good. It's something I'm really interested in seeing more of.
Thank you. Andrea, from your vantage point?
So the first thing I'd say is just the attention. CFPB has been working on wealth inequality for 35 years, and for most of that time, it's been a lonely, lonely slog. In the last several years, the attention, who would have thought that a 700-page economics book would become a bestseller on inequality? The New York Times has a full-time reporter on inequality now. So just people saying this is an issue that's important, we need to learn about it, we need to read about it, and we need to share our strategies is huge. It's huge. A second piece is the issue of inclusion. We now see that this issue affects much more than people that we defined as poor, and all the baggage and cultural inferences that meant. We are now very focused on how do our children have a life as good or better than ours, and what does that future look like, particularly in the midst of dramatic change we've all described on this webinar for the last hour. And so that has made for new coalitions and new collaborations and partnerships. I have a relationship with the major lobbyist on retirement who understood that if we don't help low-income people save, our industry is not going to have a future. It's those kind of insights that help change the way the game is played for all of us that I find incredibly encouraging. As Samira said, we have new knowledge about what works. And that power and the power of the research and the evidence base, to me, is so compelling. We've just worked with the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau to create the first consumer-driven definition of financial well-being. That is a definition that is for everyone. And that is a definition that we can use to help design programs that we never had before. So that kind of insight and evidence is key. And then the last piece I'll say is now we have a whole army of people who have a background in all the sectors. And I think about how lucky I am to have a background in finance and run a nonprofit. How lucky I am to have classmates or other folks in the other sectors who understand already that we have to work together and we fashion solutions to do that. So I think that the whole mission of educating leaders in business and society, no matter which school it is, no matter which discipline, is also one of the positive trends.
Thank you to each of you and to our participants. I think clearly when we were framing this and thinking how important it is to address these kinds of issues, have all the sectors engaged, it's very clear that that's what's going on. A lot of talk about engagement, innovation, collaboration, perseverance, and the traits that hopefully at SOM we're well prepared to absorb and apply. And okay, the law school too. So thank you to Colleen and Andrea and Samira, and thank you all for joining us, and stay tuned, and we'll be in touch.